Section 27 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 8, Chapter 1. It was the heart of the London season, nearly 4 years ago, 12 months having almost elapsed since the occurrence of those painful passages at Hellingsley which closed the last book of this history, and long lines of carriages an hour before midnight up to the classic Mount of St. James and along Piccadilly intimated that the world were received at some grand entertainment in Arlington Street. It was the town mansion of the noble family beneath whose roof at Beaumanoir we have more than once introduced the reader, to gain whose courtyard was at this moment the object of emulous coachmen, and to enter whose saloons was to reward the martyr-like patience of their lords and ladies. Among the fortunate who had already succeeded in bowing to their hostess were two gentlemen who, ensconced in a good position, surveyed the scene and made their observations on the passing guests. They were gentlemen who, to judge from their general air and their great consideration with which they were treated by those who were occasionally in their vicinity, were personages whose criticism bore authority. "I say, Jemmy," said the eldest, a dandy who had dined with the Regent, but who was still a dandy, and who enjoyed life almost as much as in the days when Carlton House occupied the terrace which still bears its name. "I say, Jemmy, what a load of young fellows there are! Don't know their names at all. Begin to think fellows are younger than they used to be. Amazing load of young fellows, indeed!" At this moment an individual who came under the fortunate designation of a young fellow, but whose assured carriage hardly intimated that this was his first season in London, came up to the junior of the two critics and said, "A pretty turn you played us yesterday at White's, Melton. We waited dinner nearly an hour." "My dear fellow, I am infinitely sorry, but I was obliged to go down to Windsor, and I missed the return train. A good dinner? Who had you?" "A capital party, only you were wanted. We had Beaumanoir and Vere and Jack Tufton and Spraggs." "Was Spraggs rich?" "Wasn't he? I have not done laughing yet. He told us a story about the little Biron who was over here last year. I knew her at Paris, and an Indian screen. Killing. Get him to tell it you. The richest thing you ever heard." "Who's your friend?" inquired Mr. Melton's companion, as the young man moved away. "Sir Charles Buckhurst." "Ah! That is Sir Charles Buckhurst. Glad to have seen him. They say he is going it." "He knows what he is about." "Egad, so they all do. A young fellow now of 2 or 3 and 20 knows the world as men used to do after as many years of scrapes. I wonder where there is such a thing as a greenhorn. Effie Crabb says the reason he gives up his house is that he has cleaned out the old generation, and that the new generation would clean him." "Buckhurst is not in that sort of way. He swears by Henry Sydney, a younger son of the Duke, whom you don't know, and young Coningsby, a sort of new set, new ideas and all that sort of thing. Beau tells me a good deal about it, and when I was staying with the Everinghams at Easter they were full of it. Coningsby had just returned from his travels, and they were quite on the qui vive. Lady Everingham is one of their set. I don't know what it is exactly, but I think we shall hear more of it." "A sort of animal magnetism, or unknown tongues, I take it from your description," said his companion. "Well, I don't know what it is," said Mr. Melton, "but it has got hold of all the young fellows who have just come out. Beau is a little bit himself. I had some idea of giving my mind to it, they made such a fuss about it at Everingham, but it requires a devilish deal of history, I believe, and all that sort of thing." "Ah, that's a bore," said his companion. "It is difficult to turn to with a new thing, when you are not in the habit of it. I never could manage charades." Mr. Ormsby, passing by, stopped. "They told me you had the gout, Cassilis," he said to Mr. Melton's companion. "So I had, but I have found a fellow who cures the gout instanter. Tom Needham sent him to me, a German fellow, pumice stone pills, sort of a charm, I believe, and all that kind of thing. They say it rubs the gout out of you. I sent him to Luxborough, who was very bad. Cured him directly. Luxborough swears by him. But there's a new thing that Melton has been telling me of, that all the world is going to believe in,' said Mr. Cassilis. 'Something patronised by Lady Everingham.' 'A very good patroness,' said Mr. Ormsby. 'Have you heard anything about it?' continued Mr. Cassilis. 'Young Coningsby brought it from abroad. Didn't you say so, Jemmy?' 'No, no, my dear fellow, it is not at all that sort of thing.' 'But they say it requires a deuced deal of history,' continued Mr. Cassilis. 'One must brush up one's Goldsmith. Canterton used to be the fellow for history at White's. He was always boring one with William the Conqueror, Julius Caesar, and all that sort of thing.' 'I tell you what,' said Mr. Ormsby, looking both sly and solemn, 'I should not be surprised if some day or another we have a history about Lady Everingham and young Coningsby.' 'Pooh!' said Mr. Melton. 'He's engaged to be married to her sister, Lady Theresa.' 'The deuce!' said Mr. Ormsby. 'Well, you are a friend of the family, and I suppose you know?' 'He is a devilish good looking fellow, that young Coningsby,' said Mr. Cassilis. 'All the women are in love with him, they say. Lady Eleanor Ducie quite raves about him.' 'By the bye, his grandfather has been very unwell,' said Mr. Ormsby, looking mysteriously. 'I saw Lady Monmouth here just now,' said Mr. Melton. 'Oh, he is quite well again,' said Mr. Ormsby. 'Got an odd story at White's that Lord Monmouth was going to separate from her,' said Mr. Cassilis. 'No foundation,' said Mr. Ormsby, shaking his head. 'They are not going to separate, I believe,' said Mr. Melton, 'but I rather think there was a foundation for the rumour.' Mr. Ormsby still shook his head. 'Well,' continued Mr. Melton, 'all I know is, that it was looked upon last winter at Paris as a settled thing.' 'There was some story about some Hungarian,' said Mr. Cassilis. 'No, that blew over,' said Mr. Melton. 'It was Trautsmansdorff the row was about.' All this time Mr. Ormsby, as the friend of Lord and Lady Monmouth, remained shaking his head; but, as a member of society, and therefore delighting in small scandal, appropriating the gossip with the greatest avidity. 'I should think old Monmouth was not the sort of fellow to blow up a woman,' said Mr. Cassilis. 'Provided she would leave him quietly,' said Mr. Melton. 'Yes, Lord Monmouth never could live with a woman more than 2 years,' said Mr. Ormsby pensively. 'And that I thought at the time rather an objection to his marriage.' We must now briefly revert to what befell our hero after those unhappy occurrences, in the midst of whose first woe we left him. The day after the arrival of Mr. Rigby at the Castle, Coningsby quitted it for London, and before a week had elapsed had embarked for Cadiz. He felt a romantic interest in visiting the land to which Edith owed some blood, and in acquiring the language which he had often admired as she spoke it. A favourable opportunity permitted him in the autumn to visit Athens and the Aegean, which he much desired. In the pensive beauties of that delicate land, where perpetual autumn seems to reign, Coningsby found solace. There is something in the character of Grecian scenery which blends with the humour of the melancholy and the feelings of the sorrowful. Coningsby passed his winter at Rome. The wish of his grandfather had rendered it necessary for him to return to England somewhat abruptly. Lord Monmouth had not visited his native country since his marriage; but the period that had elapsed since that event had considerably improved the prospects of his party. The majority of the Whig cabinet in the House of Commons by 1840 had become little more than nominal; and though it was circulated among their friends, as if from the highest authority, that 'one was enough,' there seemed daily a better chance of their being deprived even of that magical unit. For the first time in the history of this country, since the introduction of the system of parliamentary sovereignty, the government of England depended on the fate of single elections, and indeed by a single vote. It is remarkable to observe the fate of the Whig government was ultimately decided. This critical state of affairs duly reported to Lord Monmouth, revived his political passions, and offered him that excitement which he was ever seeking, and yet for which he had often sighed. The Marquess, too, was weary of Paris. Every day he found it more difficult to be amused. Lucretia had lost her charm. He, from whom nothing could be concealed, perceived that often, while she elaborately attempted to divert him, her mind was wandering elsewhere. Lord Monmouth was quite superior to all petty jealousy and the vulgar feelings of inferior mortals, but his sublime selfishness required devotion. He had calculated that a wife or a mistress who might be in love with another man, however powerfully their interests might prompt them, could not be so agreeable or amusing to their friends and husbands as if they had no such distracting hold upon their hearts or their fancy. Latterly at Paris, while Lucretia became each day more involved in the vortex of society where all admired and some adored her, Lord Monmouth fell into the easy habit of dining in his private rooms, sometimes tête à tête with Villebecque, whose inexhaustible tales and adventures about a kind of society which Lord Monmouth had always preferred infinitely to the polished and somewhat insipid circles in which he was born, had rendered him the prime favourite of his great patron. Sometimes Villebecque, too, brought a friend, male or otherwise, whom he thought invested with the rare faculty of distraction. Lord Monmouth cared not who or what they were, provided they were diverting. Villebecque had written to Coningsby at Rome, by his grandfather's desire, to beg him to return to England and meet Lord Monmouth there. The letter was couched with all the respect and good feeling which Villebecque really entertained for him whom he addressed. Still, a letter on such a subject, from such a person, was not agreeable to Coningsby, and his reply to it was direct to his grandfather. Lord Monmouth, however, had entirely given over writing letters. Coningsby had met at Paris, on his way to England, Lord and Lady Everingham, and he had returned with them. This revival of an old acquaintance was both agreeable and fortunate for our hero. The vivacity of a clever and charming woman pleasantly disturbed the brooding memory of Coningsby. There is no mortification, however keen, no misery, however desperate, which the spirit of woman cannot in some degree lighten or alleviate. About, too, to make his formal entrance into the great world, he could not have secured a more valuable and accomplished female friend. She gave him every instruction, every intimation that was necessary, cleared the social difficulties which in some degree are experienced on their entrance into the world even by the most highly connected, unless they have this benign assistance, planted him immediately in the position which was expedient, took care that he was invited at once to the right houses, and, with the aid of her husband, that he should become a member of the right clubs. 'And who is to have the blue ribbon, Lord Eskdale?' said the Duchess to that nobleman, as he entered and approached to pay his respects. 'If I were Melbourne, I would keep it open,' replied his Lordship. 'It is a mistake to give away too quickly.' 'But suppose they go out?' said her Grace. 'Oh, there is always a last day to clear the house. But they will be in another year. The cliff will not be sapped before then. We made a mistake last year about the ladies.' 'I know you always thought so.' 'Quarrels about women are always a mistake. One should make it a rule to give up to them, and then they are sure to give up to us.' 'You have no great faith in our firmness?' 'Male firmness is very often obstinacy. Women have always something better, worth all qualities. They have tact.' 'A compliment to the sex from so finished a critic as Lord Eskdale is appreciated.' But at this moment the arrival of some guests terminated the conversation, and Lord Eskdale moved away, and approached a group which Lady Everingham was enlightening. 'My dear Lord Fitz Booby,' her ladyship observed, 'in politics we require faith as well as in all other things.' Lord Fitz Booby looked rather perplexed, but, possessed of considerable official experience, having held high posts, some in the cabinet, for nearly a quarter of a century, he was too versed to acknowledge that he had not understood a single word that had been addressed to him for the last 10 minutes. He looked on with the same grave, attentive stolidity, occasionally nodding his head, as he was wont of yore when he received a deputation on sugar duties or joint stock banks, and when he made, as was his custom, when particularly perplexed, an occasional note on a sheet of foolscap paper. 'An opposition in an age of revolution,' continued Lady Everingham, 'must be founded on principles. It cannot depend on mere personal ability and party address taking advantage of circumstances. You have not enunciated a principle for the last 10 years, and when you seemed on the point of acceding to power, it was not on a great question of national interest, but a technical dispute respecting the constitution of an exhausted sugar colony. If you are a Conservative party, we wish to know what you want to conserve,' said Lord Vere. 'If it had not been for the Whig abolition of slavery,' said Lord Fitz Booby, goaded into repartee, 'Jamaica would not have been an exhausted sugar colony.' 'Then what you do want to conserve is slavery?' said Lord Vere. 'No,' said Lord Fitz Booby, 'I am never for retracing our steps.' 'But will you advance? Will you move? And where will you advance, and how will you move?' said Lady Everingham. 'I think we have had quite enough of advancing,' said his Lordship. 'I had no idea your Ladyship was a member of the Movement party,' he added, with a sarcastic grin. 'But if it were bad, Lord Fitz Booby, to move where we are, as you and your friends have always maintained, how can you reconcile it to principle to remain there?' said Lord Vere. 'I would make the best of a bad bargain,' said Lord Fitz Booby. 'With a Conservative government, a reformed constitution would be less dangerous.' 'Why?' said Lady Everingham. 'What are your distinctive principles that render the peril less?' 'I appeal to Lord Eskdale,' said Lord Fitz Booby. 'There is Lady Everingham turned quite a Radical, I declare. Is not your Lordship of opinion that the country must be safer with a Conservative government than with a Liberal?' 'I think the country is always tolerably secure,' said Lord Eskdale. Lady Theresa, leaning on the arm of Mr. Lyle, came up at this moment, and unconsciously made a diversion in favour of Lord Fitz Booby. 'Pray, Theresa,' said Lady Everingham, 'where is Mr. Coningsby?' 'Let us endeavour to ascertain. It so happened that on this day Coningsby and Henry Sydney dined at Grillion's, at the University Club, where, among many friends whom Coningsby had not met for a long time, and among delightful reminiscences, the unconscious hours stole on. It was late when they quitted Grillion's, and Coningsby's brougham was detained for a considerable time before its driver could insinuate himself into the line, which indeed he never would have succeeded in doing, had he not fortunately come across the coachman of the Duke of Agincourt, who, being of the same politics as himself, belonging to the same club, and always blackballing the same men, let him in from a legitimate party feeling. So they arrived in Arlington Street at a very late hour. Coningsby was springing up the staircase, now not so crowded as it had been, and met a retiring party. He was about to say a passing word to a gentleman as he went by, when suddenly Coningsby turned deadly pale. The gentleman could hardly be the cause, for it was the gracious and handsome presence of Lord Beaumanoir. The lady resting on his arm was Edith. They moved on while he was motionless, yet Edith and himself had exchanged glances. His was one of astonishment, but what was the expression of hers? She must have recognised him before he had observed her. She was collected, and she expressed the purpose of her mind in a distant and haughty recognition. Coningsby remained for a moment stupefied; then suddenly turning back, he bounded downstairs and hurried into the cloak room. He met Lady Wallinger. He spoke rapidly. He held her hand, did not listen to her answers. His eyes wandered about. There were many persons present. At length he recognised Edith enveloped in her mantle. He went forward. He looked at her, as if he would have read her soul. He said something. She changed colour as he addressed her, but seemed instantly by an effort to rally and regain her equanimity, replied to his inquiries with extreme brevity, and Lady Wallinger's carriage being announced, moved away with the same slightly haughty salute as before on the arm of Lord Beaumanoir. Chapter 2. Sadness fell over the once happy family of Millbank after the departure of Coningsby from Hellingsley. When the first pang was over, Edith had found some solace in the sympathy of her aunt, who had always appreciated and admired Coningsby; but it was a sympathy which aspired only to soften sorrow, and not to create hope. But Lady Wallinger, though she lengthened her visit for the sake of her niece, in time quitted them, and then the name of Coningsby was never heard by Edith. Her brother, shortly after the sorrowful and abrupt departure of his friend, had gone to the factories, where he remained, and of which, in future, it was intended that he should assume the principal direction. Mr. Millbank himself, sustained at first by the society of his friend Sir Joseph, to whom he was attached, and occupied with daily reports from his establishment and the transaction of affairs with his numerous and busy constituents, was for a while scarcely conscious of the alteration which had taken place in the demeanour of his daughter. But when they were once more alone together, it was impossible any longer to be blind to the great change. That happy and equable gaiety of spirit, which seemed to spring from an innocent enjoyment of existence, and which had ever distinguished Edith, was wanting. Her sunny glance was gone. She was not indeed always moody and dispirited, but she was fitful, unequal in her tone. That temper whose sweetness had been a domestic proverb had become a little uncertain. Not that her affection for her father was diminished, but there were snatches of unusual irritability which momentarily escaped her, followed by bursts of tenderness that were the creatures of compunction. And often, after some hasty word, she would throw her arms round her father's neck with the fondness of remorse. She pursued her usual avocations, for she had really too well regulated a mind; she was in truth a person of too strong an intellect to neglect any source of occupation and distraction. Her flowers, her pencil, and her books supplied her with these, and music soothed and at times beguiled her agitated thoughts; but there was no joy in the house, and in time Mr. Millbank felt it. Mr. Millbank was vexed, irritated, grieved. Edith, his Edith, the pride and delight of his existence, who had been to him only a source of exultation and felicity, was no longer happy, was perhaps pining away; and there was the appearance, the unjust appearance, that he, her fond father, was the cause and occasion of all this wretchedness. It would appear that the name of Coningsby, to which he now owed a great debt of gratitude, was still doomed to bear him mortification and misery. Truly had the young man said that there was a curse upon their two families. And yet, on reflection, it still seemed to Mr. Millbank that he had acted with as much wisdom and real kindness as decision. How otherwise was he to have acted? The union was impossible; the speedier their separation, therefore, clearly the better. Unfortunate indeed had been his absence from Hellingsley. Unquestionably his presence might have prevented the catastrophe. Oswald should have hindered all this. And yet Mr. Millbank could not shut his eyes to the devotion of his son to Coningsby. He felt he could count on no assistance in this respect from that quarter. Yet how hard upon him that he should seem to figure as a despot or a tyrant to his own children, whom he loved, when he had absolutely acted in an inevitable manner. Edith seemed sad, Oswald sullen; all was changed. All the objects for which this clear-headed, strong-minded, kind-hearted man had been working all his life seemed to be frustrated. And why? Because the young man had made love to his daughter, who was really in no manner entitled to do so. As the autumn drew on, Mr. Millbank found Hellingsley, under existing circumstances, extremely wearisome, and he proposed to his daughter that they should pay a visit to their earlier home. Edith assented without difficulty, but without interest. And yet, as Mr. Millbank immediately perceived, the change was a judicious one, for certainly the spirits of Edith seemed to improve after her return to their valley. There were more objects of interest. Change, too, is always beneficial. If Mr. Millbank had been aware that Oswald had received a letter from Coningsby, written before he quitted Spain, perhaps he might have recognised a more satisfactory reason for the transient liveliness of his daughter which had so greatly gratified him. About a month after Christmas, the meeting of Parliament summoned Mr. Millbank up to London, and he had wished Edith to accompany him. But London in February to Edith, without friends or connections, her father always occupied and absent from her day and night, seemed to them all, on reflection, to be a life not very conducive to health or cheerfulness, and therefore she remained with her brother. Oswald had heard from Coningsby again from Rome, but at the period he wrote he did not anticipate his return to England. His tone was affectionate but dispirited. Lady Wallinger went up to London after Easter for the season, and Mr. Millbank, now that there was a constant companion for his daughter, took a house and carried Edith back with him to London. Lady Wallinger, who had great wealth and great tact, had obtained by degrees a not inconsiderable position in society. She had a fine house in a fashionable situation, and gave profuse entertainments. The Whigs were under obligations to her husband, and the great Whig ladies were gratified to find in his wife a polished and pleasing person, to whom they could be courteous without any annoyance. So that Edith, under the auspices of her aunt, found herself at once in circles which otherwise she might not easily have entered, but which her beauty, grace, and experience of the most refined society of the Continent qualified her to shine in. One evening they met the Marquis of Beaumanoir, their friend of Rome and Paris, and admirer of Edith, who from that time was seldom from their side. His mother, the Duchess, immediately called both on the Millbanks and the Wallingers, glad not only to please her son, but to express that consideration for Mr. Millbank which the Duke always wished to show. It was, however, of no use. Nothing would induce Mr. Millbank ever to enter what he called aristocratic society. He liked the House of Commons, never paired off, never missed a moment of it, worked at committees all the morning, listened attentively to debates all the night, always dined at Bellamy's when there was a House, and when there was not, liked dining at the Fishmongers' Company, the Russia Company, great emigration banquets, and other joint stock festivities. That was his idea of rational society: business and pleasure combined, a good dinner, and good speeches afterwards. Edith was aware that Coningsby had returned to England, for her brother had heard from him on his arrival, but Oswald had not heard since. A season in London only represented in the mind of Edith the chance, perhaps the certainty, of meeting Coningsby again, of communing together over the catastrophe of last summer, of soothing and solacing each other's unhappiness, and perhaps, with the sanguine imagination of youth, foreseeing a more felicitous future. She had been nearly a fortnight in town, and though moving frequently in the same circles as Coningsby, they had not yet met. It was one of those results which could rarely occur, but even chance enters too frequently into the league against lovers. The invitation to the assembly at House was therefore particularly gratifying to Edith, since she could scarcely doubt that if Coningsby were in town, which her casual inquiries of Lord Beaumanoir induced her to believe was the case, he would be present. Never, therefore, had she repaired to an assembly with such a flattering spirit, and yet there was a fascinating anxiety about it that bewilders the young heart. In vain Edith surveyed the rooms to catch the form of that being whom for a moment she had never ceased to cherish and muse over. He was not there, and at the very moment when, disappointed and mortified, she most required solace, she learned from Mr. Melton that Lady Theresa Sydney, whom she chanced to admire, was going to be married, and to Mr. Coningsby. What a revelation! His silence, perhaps his shunning of her, were no longer inexplicable. What a return for all her romantic devotion in her sad solitude at Hellingsley! Was this to be the end of their twilight rambles, and the sweet pathos of their mutual loves? There seemed to be no truth in man, no joy in life. All the feelings that she had so generously lavished, all returned upon herself. She could have burst into a passion of tears and buried herself in a cloister. Instead of that, civilisation made her listen with a serene though tortured countenance; but as soon as it was in her power, pleading a headache to Lady Wallinger, she effected, or thought she had effected, her escape from a scene which harrowed her heart. As for Coningsby, he passed a sleepless night, agitated by the unexpected presence of Edith, and distracted by the manner in which she had received him. To say that her appearance had revived all his passionate affection for her would convey an unjust impression of the nature of his feelings. His affection had never for a moment swerved. It was profound and firm. But unquestionably this sudden vision had brought before him, in startling and more vivid colours, the relations that subsisted between them. There was the being whom he loved and who loved him, and whatever were the barriers which the circumstances of life placed against their union, they were partakers of the solemn sacrament of an unpolluted heart. Coningsby, as we have mentioned, had signified to Oswald his return to England. He had hitherto omitted to write again, not because his spirit faltered, but he was wearied of whispering hope without foundation, and mourning over his chagrined fortunes. Once more in England, once more placed in communication with his grandfather, he felt an increased conviction the difficulties which surrounded him. The society of Lady Everingham and her sister, who had been at the same time her visitor, had been a relaxation, and a beneficial one, to a mind suffering too much from the tension of one idea. But Coningsby had treated the matrimonial project of his gay-minded hostess with the courteous levity in which he believed it at first half originated. He admired and liked Lady Theresa, but there was a reason why he should not marry her, even had his own heart not been absorbed by one of those passions from which men of deep and earnest character never emancipate themselves. After musing and meditating again and again over everything that had occurred, Coningsby fell asleep when the morning had far advanced, resolved to rise when a little refreshed, and find out Lady Wallinger, who, he felt sure, would receive him with kindness. Yet it was fated that this step should not be taken, for while he was at breakfast his servant brought him a letter from Monmouth House, apprising him that his grandfather wished to see him as soon as possible on urgent business. Chapter 3